developer Compulsion Games continues its impressive streak of eye-catching, visually creative projects with South of Midnight. This time, we explore the American Deep South, as seen through the eyes of Hazel, who leaps into a world filled with all manner of gothic myths and legends. It's an utterly unique premise, and the third game from the studio to champion an aesthetic of some kind, following the Shadow Interplay in 2013's puzzle platformer Contrast, and 2018's We Happy Few, a partially crowd-funded effort with an eerie dystopian backdrop. The twist this time is that South of Midnight's tale plays out using a stop-motion style of animation. To complete the effect, the game puts an arbitrary frame rate in place, notably in its cutscenes, simulating the staccato motion of an animated feature. In terms of platforms, it's an Xbox Series X and S exclusive with a PC release too. So just how does each version compare? And is it possible that this time, Series S users get a comparable 60 frames per second experience to the Series X? Let's find out. South of Midnight is what we might call a AA game, a single-player, 12-ish hour adventure that fits the bill for a Game Pass release well. Compulsion Games focuses on three core pillars of gameplay here: platforming, combat, and physics-based puzzling. Hazel's abilities as a weaver, a spellcaster, lets us glide through the air, push, pull, and apparate scenery into existence, and even snare enemies in battle. In every aspect, this idea of manipulating the world with threads is well realized. Movement has a satisfying flow to it, especially as each skill unlocks, and the route ahead is always clearly telegraphed to the player with an optional trail if you need a hint. There are higher difficulty settings, but on the default one, I found it a pleasant ride simply as is. It's linear in structure, no question, but given the deluge of open world extravaganzas as of late, it's refreshing to have a more guided experience for a change. In terms of its technology, there's no official line on whether this is using Unreal Engine 4 or 5, but looking at the PC install directory, there are crash dump files which heavily suggest UE4 as a base. Either way, it builds on Compulsion's experience with Unreal Engine following We Happy Few, albeit with a pure focus on current-gen consoles. The highlight this time though is of course South of Midnight's stop-motion animation style. To break this technique down, all cutscenes run at 30 frames per second on Xbox Series X, S, and even PC. There is no way to opt out of this 30 FPS cap on any platform, but this is a crucial ingredient to its visual style. Within this 30 FPS update, certain elements are chopped down even further for effect. Facial movements, for example, run at 15 FPS, creating the illusion of faceplates being replaced every other frame. Meanwhile, most of Hazel's body movements run at 30 FPS, though some elements, like the mythical creatures of the world, appear to also drop down to 15. All combined, the stop-motion effect is a convincing one, creating an otherworldly motion that suits the story well. Of course, we've seen this very same technique used in other Unreal Engine games, most recently with Hi-Fi Rush's vivid imitation of a Saturday morning cartoon. Likewise, it perfectly captures the anime influence on Arc System Works' Guilty Gear Strive, with pre-fight sequences running at 8, 10, 15 FPS or even higher. South of Midnight goes a further step though, by extending this to the controllable gameplay itself. To be clear, gameplay runs at 60 frames per second, as it should given the focus on timing sensitive combat and platform jumping. But you'll notice Hazel's running animation and the movement on the world's creatures have this subtle stop motion effect. The technique isn't as aggressively deployed as, say, the cutscenes, and the exact frame rate of each element is hard to pin down. Fortunately, there is a toggle in the menus on Xbox and PC to disable the effect, supposing you want a fluid 60 FPS update for controllable play. To the comparisons, and this is remarkably straightforward this time. The big difference between Series S and Series X is their resolution targets. On Series X, we're running at a dynamic range with 4K as the peak target, dropping to 1080p in the worst case with lots of action. Series S, meanwhile, drops that down to a 1080p maximum target, while taxing areas push the pixel count down to 960 by 540. Each one then uses what appears to be Unreal Engine's TAAU method to upscale to their respective targets. For Series S, that worst case 540p value does inevitably mean image quality takes a hit, especially in one early sequence with heavy rain where the flashes of lightning reveal the raw pixel structure. It creates a mushy, blurrier resolve, even if for just a few frames, but in most chapters, Series S holds up surprisingly well. You'll also notice the differing resolution outputs of each console affects the depth of field effect as a byproduct, while most other visual settings are identical. Largely, I suspect this is thanks to the game's heavy stylization. Series S is able to compete with Series X in texture quality, ambient occlusion, and draw distances, with only a subtle divide in shadow quality to speak on. Speaking of which, a quick look at the PC version is also illuminating. With all settings set to Ultra on PC, and the resolution fixed at a native 4K as well, the Series X version still spits out a competitive image in side-by-sides. Again, shadow quality is really the main dividing point, with PC pushing cleaner, crisper shadows further to the distance. The PC edition also offers up options for DLSS upscaling and frame gen. So my RTX 4080 setup comfortably maxes out the game at 4K and Ultra settings at between 65 to 80 FPS. But with DLSS quality engaged and frame gen activated, I was able to jump up to 100 to 120 FPS without much issue. The one downside is the occasional hitch in play. There is a short shader compilation preload on booting the game, which avoids the issue for the most part, except capping play at 60 FPS for example here. Any appearance of these ghost-like Weaver characters ahead would strangely still cue a hiccup. Most of play is unaffected, but it seems that there are these lingering streaming issues that need to be fixed. The state of console performance is also remarkably clear-cut, with both Series X and S running at 60 FPS in gameplay. There is no graphics mode toggle in this case, no performance or fidelity options as is the trend this generation. It just runs at a VSync 60 out of the box, which is great news. Huge props to Compulsion then for building the experience so strictly around hitting that target. No doubt the game's focus on more linear, scripted environments and events must help in optimizing for both machines. And coming straight after the likes of Assassin's Creed Shadows and Atomfall, more open world affairs with ray traced technologies, it's a relief that Series S users don't lose out this time by being lumped with a 30 FPS cap. There are a few rough points, but they're hardly game-breaking overall. Firstly, much like on PC, there are moments during traversal that hitch on occasion. Encounters with those ghostly Weavers early in the adventure appear to be the cause, always triggering a small hiccup on both Series X and S in the exact same spot. It's infrequent, but sticks out nonetheless given the general success of the game's push to 60 FPS. Secondly, there are sub-60 drops in very specific areas. When Series X or S hit the bottom of their DRS ranges, the game lurches into the mid-50s for a spell. The opening chapter during the storm has an issue on both Series X and S, and also a specific combat encounter in Chapter 4 has these drops. It's all well within the VRR range if your display supports it, but I'd say that even without this feature, you'll find drops a rarity. The final point relates to the cutscenes. Of course, the capping at 30 FPS with 15 FPS animations is not necessarily a reflection of GPU limitations on either machine. Still, with that being said, sadly, the 30 FPS cap used in this case is unevenly frame-paced, causing a trill on the frame time graph on left. It ultimately makes these scenes animate more erratically than is perhaps intended, though the stop motion effect is still intact despite it. South of Midnight tells a fish out of water tale with a commendable sense of style. The stop motion effect is well executed for one, helping to elevate the mystique of its mishmash of Deep South myths. Hitting 60 frames per second on both Series X and S isn't to be taken for granted either, and it's a relief to see it here. In fact, the best optimized choice is already made in advance by Compulsion Games, with no mode toggle for us to deliberate over this time around. In this case, it works out nicely, barring a few streaming hitches early on, and even rarer sub-60 drops in battle. The only notable catch for Series S is the resolution drop, but it still holds up well, all things considered, given its 4 teraflop profile. All of which makes South of Midnight an easy one to recommend right from the get-go, regardless of which Xbox you own, and especially given it's on Game Pass from day one. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.